Hi, Mark Ranis here with Lecture 11.1 on the ad fontem fallacies. This corresponds with Section 11.1 of our text, The Reasonable Person, and it's the first or the first lecture in Chapter 11 on informal fallacies. So we'll begin with an introduction to Chapter 11 on informal fallacies, and then we'll start drilling down into the subfamilies of fallacies that we include in the group of informal fallacies that we cover in the text. That includes the fallacies of relevance, and then one of the groups inside the fallacies of relevance is the ad fontem fallacies that are the subject of today's lecture. There are 4 of those, and we'll cover them in some detail, looking at each of them one by one. But the general remarks that we make at the beginning of this lecture will also be very important for learning how we tell the fallacies apart, how we remember them all, and these are things that we'll want to keep with us as we go through all the rest of the fallacies in Chapter 11. So let's get started. All right, our focus so far has been on the right way to make arguments. Fallacies are the wrong way to make arguments, and it makes sense that we focus on the right way before the wrong way. We can learn from our mistakes and we can learn from bad examples, but we always want to know how to do something right, even if we then proceed to examine what goes wrong when we do it the wrong way. Because we've come across fallacies before, we already know their definition. A fallacy is any defect in reasoning. And we know that it doesn't have to be an especially serious defect. We don't reserve the word fallacy for things that are real problems, big problems. We use a fallacy for any defect in reasoning. Now, most of the fallacies that we've encountered so far have been purely formal. That is, you can recognize them with nonsense words like snarks and boojums and wangdoodles. You can recognize them even when we're only using letters to stand in for things. Things like the undistributed middle or exclusive premises. These are clear and objective. Not everyone knows what they are, but if there are 2 people who both know what the fallacy of the undistributed middle is, then there's no chance that they will disagree about whether it is or isn't present in some argument. It either is or it isn't, and everyone who understands the concept will know whether it is or whether it is not. But some of the fallacies that we've encountered along our way are not like that. They're more debatable. They're more in a gray area. For example, when we were looking at the fallacies of clarity, we encountered the fallacies of equivocation and distinction without a difference. I used outrageously plain examples like the 2 different meanings of the word pen or the 2 different meanings of the word light. I did that because I wanted to make sure that everyone saw what was going on with the 2 meanings. But in real life, people don't usually make mistakes quite that exaggerated. In real life, 2 people can go a long time figuring out whether they're actually talking about the same thing when they each refer to a word like right. I have a right to do something. Does that mean a legal right? It would be it's against the law to stop me, or does it mean that it would be fair for me to insist on this? Is it some kind of moral right? Well, people aren't always clear on that themselves until they come up against an agreement. So a lot of times with these kinds of fallacies, they depend not just on form, but on what we're talking about, the matter of the conversation. And sometimes they even depend on the context of the conversation. These are the kinds of fallacies that we call informal fallacies. We call them informal not because they dress a little sloppy or they use the wrong fork for dinner. We call them informal because they're simply not formal. They depend on more than mere form. So in this chapter on informal fallacies, we're going to learn 18 additional ways not to make a good argument. They're not things to do, they're things to avoid. They're all informal fallacies. One other note, they're not names to call people who you disagree with. And they are certainly not insults to sling around, especially at home with people who haven't studied logic. All right, let's move on and discuss the first of these big families of fallacies, the fallacies of relevance. Now, you might be surprised, as I was surprised, to learn that there is no generally accepted theory that unifies all fallacies. In other words, I've given you the definition. It's any defect in reasoning, and you really can't say very much more than that. I found this surprising because there are lists of fallacies going all the way back to Aristotle. And you'd think in 25 centuries that maybe people would have worked this out. But actually, all they've done is produce more and more lists, and the lists don't agree. When I needed to find a book that covered all the fallacies I wanted to teach, I naturally thought, well, how many are there? There's no good answer to that question. There's no one answer to that question. I found some books that covered 5 fallacies. I found some books that covered 45 fallacies. And if you wanted to know, well, gosh, isn't number 17 very similar to number 35? Are those really different? Are they related in any way? Sorry, nothing to tell you in that book. Just memorize them, and then you'll know, right? Well, I found this sort of unsatisfying. So what I've tried to do is collect a bunch of fallacies that I can group according to what seems to be the trouble, and not cover a lot of things that are sort of the same thing. That's got it down to 18. Now, they're easiest to learn in families and subfamilies. So while, I could just give you a big list and say memorize all these definitions, that would be pretty hard. It's actually easier if we narrow it down to just a couple of families and subfamilies, and then we can keep track of them better. So that's what we've done with the group of fallacies of relevance. A fallacy of relevance is any defect in reasoning, that is, any fallacy, that introduces an irrelevant basis for affirming or denying a proposition under consideration. So note that we're starting right away with knowing what we're talking about, knowing what the proposition under consideration is. And then, since we know what relevance is, anything that makes that proposition either more probable or less probable, anything that tries to introduce something irrelevant, we're going to call that a fallacy of relevance, right? A defect in reasoning. Now, the fallacies of relevance also include other subfamilies. For example, the ad fontem fallacies that we're talking about today, the emotive fallacies that we're going to talk about in section 11.2, and the fallacies of misdirection that we talk about in section 11.3. All 3 of these subfamilies are also fallacies of relevance. And there's something that holds all of them together as fallacies of relevance, but also something that distinguishes them from each other. In all of these cases, what holds them together is that the problem is going to arise from a mismatch between whatever our intended conclusion is, the proposition that we're advancing, and the reasons given for it. In other words, it's going to be a problem of relevance. Well, today's subfamily is the ad fontem fallacies, so let's get started with those. Here's the definition. An ad fontem fallacy is any fallacy of relevance in which someone tries to affirm or deny a proposition based on the source of the argument. Now, as I often do, I've used red to highlight the 2 things here that I want you to pay close attention to. And if you remember the work that we did back in chapter 4 on definition and division, then I think you'll appreciate what it is that we're doing here. First of all, when I say that it has to be a fallacy of relevance, that's the group of which the ad fontem fallacies are a part. You might say the genus in which they are. And when I say that it has to be based on the source of the argument, that's the differentiating element in the definition. So, if it's not a fallacy of relevance, it can't be an ad fontem fallacy. That is the vertical dimension of what ties ad fontem fallacies to fallacies of relevance. But then we also have to look at this horizontal dimension. What is it that distinguishes the ad fontem fallacies from other fallacies of relevance? And what it is the focus on the source of the argument. Now, there are 4 of these in common currency, and we're going to learn all of them today. They are the personal attack, the 2 wrongs fallacy, the genetic fallacy, and the questionable authority fallacy. And 2 of these have Latin names that you should also know as well, but we'll cover all 4 of these right now. All right, the argumentum ad hominem, which is a Latin word that goes way back and that you should probably know, but it means a personal attack, right? The argument against the person, the personal attack. We can define this as the ad fontem fallacy in which someone tries to affirm or deny a proposition by attacking its proponent personally instead of addressing the merits of the argument. Note again both the horizontal and the vertical dimension. If it's not an ad fontem fallacy, then it's not an ad hominem. But what distinguishes the ad hominem from the other ad fontem fallacies is this element of personal attack. Whenever you're going after the person who's putting the proposition forward, that's when you should be thinking about the ad hominem argument. But it's a little complicated because not all personal attacks are fallacious, only the irrelevant ones. This is because personal character, for example, especially honesty, is often extremely relevant in lots of situations. And yet, when you say something about something negative about someone's personal character, especially their honesty, that's one of the most abusive things that you can say about somebody. It's really mean when you go after someone's character. So we have here this situation where things are simultaneously very mean, but also very relevant. An example would be someone who has lied in court. If someone has been convicted of perjury in the past, and you say that you think the witness is lying and that he's been convicted of perjury in the past, well, that's very relevant evidence. It's very mean, right? If you say of a scientist that he's been caught falsifying data in the past, well, that's a really terrible thing to say about somebody. But if it's true, it's really relevant. So that's where we get into a gray area with the argumentum ad hominem. Not really usually on whether something is or is not a personal attack. That's usually clear. The issue is usually whether it's relevant. If the attack is relevant, then it's not a fallacy of relevance. And if it's not a fallacy of relevance, it's not an ad fontem fallacy. And if it's not an ad fontem fallacy, then you don't have an argumentum ad hominem. So when you're looking for this fallacy, stay focused on the question under consideration and simply evaluate the relevance of what is said. Evaluate the relevance of the attack and decide whether it's relevant. If it is, then you don't have an argumentum ad hominem. If it's not, then you do. All right. The second fallacy that we'll look at today is the tu quoque fallacy. You're another, sometimes called the two wrongs fallacy. The tu quoque or two wrongs fallacy is the ad fontem fallacy, in which someone tries to affirm or deny a proposition by alleging that its proponent has not always behaved consistently with it. So again, two elements. What is the more general element that unites this vertically with the family above it? It's the ad fontem fallacy part. If it's not an ad fontem fallacy, it can't be a tu quoque. But what is it that distinguishes it? What's the differentiating element? It is the focus on the proponent's behavior rather than his argument. Well, why is that irrelevant? Why is the person's behavior irrelevant? In the book, we talk about the jet-setting climate activist who tells everyone else not to fly and flies around to tell them so. Well, the problem is that inconsistent behavior doesn't always indicate that you don't believe what you're saying. For example, I teach the golden rule in my family. I will always teach the golden rule in my family. I'm not disqualified from teaching the golden rule in my family simply because I don't always live up to it. The fact that I don't live up to it doesn't mean that I don't believe it. It means that I'm human. It means that I'm weak. It's not a sign of a lack of conviction. It's a sign of a lack of discipline. So, therefore, you can't go from inconsistent behavior to the conclusion that I don't believe what I'm saying. And even if you could say that I don't believe what I'm saying, that doesn't necessarily make me wrong. For example, I teach history classes. I talk about a lot of views that have been put forward about history that I don't happen to agree with. Some students hear me talk about those views and decide that they're correct, even though that's not what I decided. Well, that's okay. People can evaluate the evidence put forward for a particular view regardless of whether I believe it. And that's true of every argument that we ever hear. So that's what makes the two wrongs fallacy fallacious, is when we take someone's behavior as a refutation of what they're saying. We need to keep our focus on the argument and not the behavior. Now, we should also distinguish logical inconsistency from inconsistent behavior. Logical inconsistency is always a problem. I say nearly always here just because I think there might be an exception, but I sure can't think of one. And it's almost always fatal to an argument. If you can show that an argument contradicts itself, that's usually the fastest way to refute it. So definitely distinguish between a contradictory argument, that's very bad, and simply an argument for a proposition that you don't always observe in your own behavior. That might be regrettable, but it doesn't undermine the logical argument. All right, let's look at the third fallacy. This is the genetic fallacy. It has nothing to do with DNA. The genetic fallacy is the ad fontem fallacy, in which someone tries to affirm or deny a proposition based on the origin of the idea or how the speaker came to believe it. So genetic, like Genesis, like what generates the idea. Origin is the main idea here. Of course, we also have the vertical and the horizontal elements here. If it's not an ad fontem fallacy, it can't be a genetic fallacy. And if it's relevant, then it's not going to be an ad fontem fallacy. So we have to go all the way up the chain and make sure that we have a defect in reasoning that is based on relevance and that goes to the source. All of that is built into our definition of a genetic fallacy. But what distinguishes this from the other ad fontem fallacies is the focus on the genesis of either the idea itself or the person's belief in it. Well, on the one hand, this is a little hard to understand, because some people might say, well, if we're talking, if someone's arguing and they're giving me the reasons for a belief, aren't the reasons the whole point of the argument? Aren't the reasons for someone believing something always relevant? Not really, or at least this is a case where there's an ambiguity in our meaning. There are two senses of because. I might say that I believe in the dignity of all human beings because we are all children of God. That because says that I have a reason for believing in that. Or I might say I believe in the dignity of all human beings because I was born in the middle of the 20th century in the United States of America. And I might acknowledge that if I had been born at other times or in other places, maybe I wouldn't believe this. That's a different sense of the word because. That's an explanation rather than a justification. And so whenever someone says something, we have to, again, keep the distinction between what the person says and whether it's true and how the person came by that knowledge. There's a story in the book about someone who discovers the shape of the benzene molecule, or at least imagines or conceives the shape of the benzene molecule because of a dream that he had about a snake eating its tail. Well, that seems crazy. But yet, benzene is shaped like that. So it doesn't really matter where the idea comes from if it's true. There's a proverb about broken clocks being right twice a day. It kind of applies here. Even blind squirrels find acorns. Yeah, right? Even if it comes from an unlikely place, even if there's some roundabout reason why the person happens to believe this, it can still be right. Well, okay, you say, but what about bias? Don't we need to be careful of people when we can see their obvious bias? We can see that this belief that they have just fits them to see. Well, of course that person would think that. It seems very convenient for them to believe that. We think this is bias. This person's view can't really be trusted because they're so biased. Well, the thing about that is you can be biased and still correct. So it's good to know about our bias. We should know about our bias. We should try and correct for our bias. We should fight our bias. But when we can't just throw out any kind of proposition that we get from someone who might have a bias. In a case, let's say a court case, most of the witnesses who testify might be biased. It might be that you can only get testimony from people who have biases. Well, we try and sort that out. We try and be aware of what the bias is and to do our best to find the truth in spite of it. All right, our fourth and final fallacy for the day is the appeal to questionable authority, or the questionable appeal to authority. This is the ad fontem fallacy, in which someone appeals to an authority without any apparent reason why the authority is relevant. So again, two factors to think about. If it's not an ad fontem fallacy, it's not the questionable authority fallacy. So we have to have a relevance problem and a problem with the source before we have the questionable authority fallacy. But what distinguishes this one from the other ad fontem fallacies is that it's the appeal to someone else, the appeal to some person who's not a party to the argument, in order to say, you should believe my proposition because of what this other person says. Now, what makes this one tricky is that we actually do need appeals to authority. It is absolutely not a fallacy to appeal to authority. Most of us can't prove the Pythagorean theorem without appealing to authority. And even if we can prove it, it's because we learned it from someone we took to be an authority. I only know what year the U.S. Civil War started or what year Columbus sailed for the Americas because I learned it from authorities. Things that I look up in books, I take on the authority of those books. So we can't advance knowledge very far if we only have our innate reason and our personal experience to go on. We use authority all the time. So we can't get along without appeals to authority. The problem is when we have an appeal to a questionable authority, when we get a celebrity endorsement for some product, and there's no reason to think that the celebrity is anything other than an actor spouting lines that were written by an advertiser. So how do we sort this out? What are some considerations that we should consult when we're trying to figure out what's trustworthy and what's not? Well, the first thing we might ask is, does the authority give any relevant reasons? In other words, if we stayed in our conversation and there were no appeal to authority, we would expect reasons to be given that count as justification for the view. If someone wants to outsource that to an authority, then it makes sense to ask, well, what's the authority saying? Is the authority giving us good reasons, or are we just supposed to take it because he said so? Another thing you might ask is the authority especially qualified? For example, does this person have an advanced degree in something that is relevant here? Has the person been certified? Does the person have long experience in the subject? If not, then why would we listen to that person? Next, is the authority biased? Again, bias is relevant. We don't throw everything out just because someone's biased, but we do want to know. And if the authority that we're given is someone who is just saying lines into a camera because he was paid by someone who wants to sell us something, well, maybe that's not a great authority. And finally, do we lack the means to reach our own conclusion, or could we do pretty well on our own? If this is not something that definitely is beyond our ken and calls for some kind of expert assistance, well, then we ought to be less ready to outsource and delegate our decision-making powers to someone we've never met. So that's the ad fontem fallacies. That's enough for today. I'll be back next time for the emotive fallacies.